I started section hiking the Appalachian Trail in the spring of 2019 with the kind of deliberate planning that my job had trained into me and the kind of naive confidence that 4 years of weekend day hikes in Shenandoah had installed in place. Of actual long-distance experience, I worked in software development in Arlington, the particular version of that career that involves sitting in a climate-controlled office in Rosslyn and looking at the Potomac through floor-to-ceiling windows and spending enough hours in front of screens that the mountains an hour and a half west start to feel like a medical necessity rather than a hobby. I'd been a day hiker since college, the kind who drives out to Old Rag or Humpback Rocks on a Saturday morning and is back in the apartment by dinner with tired legs and the satisfied feeling of someone who has done something that counts as outdoors. But section hiking was different. Section hiking meant overnights and meant solitude of a different quality and meant carrying everything you needed on your back and sleeping in shelters or in a tent at designated sites along a trail that runs 2,190 miles from Georgia to Maine through some of the most remote terrain on the East Coast. I should explain what section hiking looks like for someone with a full-time job and a life built around a metropolitan routine because the logistics matter to what happened. You pick a section, usually 20 to 40 miles. You drive to the trailhead or arrange a shuttle. You hike for 3 or 4 days, staying at shelters or campsites spaced roughly a day's walk apart. You carry a pack that weighs between 25 and 35 pounds, depending on how much you've learned about what you actually need versus what you think you need. And you encounter other hikers at varying frequencies depending on the section and the season and the particular stretch of trail you've chosen. In Virginia, which is where I did most of my sections because of proximity, the trail passes through country that alternates between ridge walking with long views and deep hollows where the forest closes in and the canopy blocks enough light that noon looks like late afternoon. The shelters are 3-sided wooden structures, most of them built by trail maintaining clubs over the decades, with wooden sleeping platforms and a fire ring out front and the kind of Spartan construction that provides a roof and walls on 3 sides and nothing else. They have names. They have logbooks where hikers sign in and write entries that range from trail conditions to philosophical observations to crude jokes. They have a character that accumulates over years of use, the particular feeling of a structure that has sheltered thousands of strangers who share nothing except the decision to walk a very long way through the woods. By October of 2021, I'd completed 11 sections totaling roughly 340 miles of the Virginia portion. I knew the rhythms. I knew what my body could do in a day and what the trail demanded in different terrain and different weather. I knew the particular silence of a mountain forest in autumn when the leaves are dropping and the undergrowth is dying back and the visibility through the trees extends further than it does in summer. The woods opening up in a way that changes the geometry of the landscape. I knew the sounds, the particular vocabulary of noises that the forest produces at different hours. The bird activity of morning, the insect drone of afternoon, the settling quiet of dusk, and the deep, layered silence of full dark, broken by wind and the occasional movement of animals in the brush. I had learned to distinguish between the sounds that belong and the sounds that don't. This is a skill that develops without instruction. The way your ears learn the acoustic signature of a place, the way your eyes learn the visual one. You stop hearing the familiar sounds as individual events, and they become texture, background, the auditory equivalent of wallpaper. And what you start hearing instead are the interruptions, the sounds that break the pattern, the noises that the forest isn't making on its own. The section I chose that October was a 28-mile stretch in the Jefferson National Forest, starting from a trailhead off Route 620 near Pearisburg and running north toward the rice fields and the Audie Murphy Monument. I'd done sections nearby, but not this particular one, and I'd planned 3 days and 2 nights with stays at 2 shelters along the route. I started on a Thursday morning in weather that was clear and cold in the way that early October in the Southern Virginia mountains produces. The temperature in the low 40s at the trailhead, and the ridges showing the first serious color of the season. I signed the register at the trailhead and started walking. The first day was uneventful in the way that good hiking days are uneventful. I covered 12 miles, reached the first shelter by mid-afternoon, and found it empty, which was typical for a Thursday in October. The shelter was old but maintained, the kind of structure that shows its age in the wood grain and the carved initials on the support beams. But that functions as well as it did when it was built. I ate, set up my sleeping bag on the platform, and wrote in the logbook. The entry above mine was from 2 days earlier, a thru-hiker headed northbound. Brief, practical, noting water sources and a blowdown across the trail a mile south. I fell asleep listening to the wind in the canopy and the particular creaking that old trees produce in moving air. The sound of wood flexing under forces it has been flexing under for decades. I started the second day early, which was my habit on the middle day of a 3-day section. The trail on this stretch climbed steeply for the first 2 miles, gaining a ridgeline that it would follow for most of the day before descending to the next shelter. The morning was overcast, the cloud ceiling sitting just above the ridge in a way that eliminated the long views and compressed the world down to the trail and the trees immediately flanking it, and nothing else. I was alone. I hadn't seen another hiker since the trailhead, and the trail register at the first shelter had shown no entries after the thru-hiker from 2 days before. This wasn't unusual for a weekday in October, but it registered in the background of my awareness the way empty shelters and absent hikers do when you're covering ground alone. I heard the footsteps for the first time at approximately 10:30 in the morning. I noted the time because I just checked my watch at a trail marker, and the footsteps began within a few minutes of that check. They were behind me. The particular sound of boots on packed earth and rock, the compression of leaf litter, the rhythmic pattern that human walking produces, and that is distinct from animal movement in both its regularity and its weight. I didn't turn around immediately. The sound was behind me and at a distance that I estimated at maybe 60 to 80 yards, which is the kind of distance that another hiker might maintain without it meaning anything. People walk at different paces, and sometimes you're aware of someone behind you for a stretch before they catch up or fall back, or you separate at a fork or a viewpoint. I kept walking. The footsteps continued. After perhaps 10 minutes, I stopped to adjust my pack strap and drink water, the kind of brief halt that takes maybe 90 seconds. The footsteps stopped. I started walking again. The footsteps resumed. I want to be clear that at this point I was not alarmed. The trail is linear. People walk the same direction. Stopping when the person ahead stops is normal because it means you're maintaining distance rather than closing it, which is actually the polite thing to do when you're behind someone on a narrow trail. I filed this in the category of normal and moved on. 30 minutes later, I rounded a switchback on a descent that gave me a clear line of sight back up the trail for roughly 200 yards. I looked back. The trail was empty, no one visible in either direction, just the narrow brown line of packed earth curving up through the trees and disappearing into the gray overhead. I stood there for a moment and listened. Silence, the forest silence that I knew. The wind and the settling sounds and nothing else. I turned and kept walking. The footsteps came back within 5 minutes. Same distance, same pace, same rhythmic, measured compression of earth and leaf. I stopped, they stopped. I walked, they walked. I timed it. For the next mile I varied my pace deliberately, slowing to a near stroll and then pushing to a pace that was just below a jog. The footsteps matched every change within seconds, not gradually, not with the natural lag of someone adjusting their stride immediately, as if whoever was behind me was watching me closely enough to mirror my pace in real time. I turned around and walked back the way I'd come. I walked 50 yards, then 100, then 150. The trail was empty. The woods on either side were the usual tangle of hardwoods and undergrowth, the October D-back making the forest more transparent than summer. but still dense enough to conceal a person standing still 20 feet from the trail. I saw no one. I heard nothing except the wind and a distant woodpecker and my own breathing and my own heartbeat. I stood in the middle of the trail facing the direction I'd come from, and I waited for 2 full minutes. Nothing moved, no sound of footsteps, no indication that anyone had been on this trail at any point today except me. I turned around and resumed walking north. The footsteps resumed within 200 yards. Behind me, same distance, same pace. I did not stop again. I hiked the remaining 7 miles to the second shelter at the fastest sustained pace I could manage with a full pack. The footsteps stayed with me for every mile. They matched every variation. They stopped precisely when I stopped to check a water crossing, and they resumed precisely when I did. When the trail descended through a series of tight switchbacks where the sight lines were short and the turns frequent, the footsteps stayed behind me at that same distance, maintaining it through turns that should have briefly brought whoever was walking into my line of sight. I never saw anyone, not a glimpse, not a shape between the trees, not a flash of color or movement. I reached the shelter at 3:40 in the afternoon. The shelter was occupied. 2 women, thru-hikers, had arrived an hour before me and were set up on the platform with their gear spread out in the organized way that long-distance hikers develop. I have never been as relieved to see other people. I sat up next to them and we talked, the easy conversation that hikers share. And I asked them whether they'd seen anyone on the trail behind me. They hadn't. They'd come from the south, from the direction I was heading, and they'd seen no one all day in either direction. The footsteps didn't return while I was at the shelter. I hiked out the next morning with the 2 thru-hikers. We walked together for the first 4 miles before our paces separated and they moved ahead. I finished the section alone. I heard nothing behind me. I've done 6 more sections since then. I have not gone back to that stretch of trail in the Jefferson National Forest. I don't think about the footsteps often, but when I do, what I return to is not the sound itself, but the pace matching, the immediate, precise, second-by-second mirroring of my speed, because an animal doesn't do that. A coincidental hiker doesn't do that. A person maintaining a casual distance doesn't adjust their stride within a heartbeat of yours through 7 miles of mountain terrain. What is that is someone who is watching you with complete attention and who has decided to let you know. They're there without letting you see them. And the question I can't answer is whether the footsteps were meant as a message or a test. Whether the point was to make me aware or to find out what I would do. The trail runs through that section of the Jefferson the same way it always has. The trees drop their leaves in October and stand bare through winter and come back in spring. And whoever was behind me on that ridge is still someone I've never seen. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to Fear Begins and hitting the like button. Share this video with someone who enjoys these kinds of stories. I'd also love to know. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your support means everything to me and keeps these stories coming. Now let's continue. I was 7 months into my thru-hike when I encountered the tent. And 7 months of continuous walking had changed the way I processed the world in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't done it. I should say something about who I was before the trail, because the person matters to the story. I was 26 and I'd quit a job in logistics management in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of job that pays well enough to fund a thru-hike if you save for 2 years, and that drains something from you steadily enough that saving for a thru-hike starts to feel like saving for an escape rather than a vacation. I was not a particularly experienced backpacker before I started. I'd done weekenders in the Pisgah and a few overnights in the Linville Gorge and one 5-day trip on the Foothills Trail in South Carolina that had taught me what my gear weighed and what my feet could handle and what the difference was between hiking for pleasure and hiking as a daily practice. The thru-hike was supposed to be the thing I did between who I had been and who I was going to become. The particular American ritual of walking a very long distance and hoping that the walking would produce a clarity that sitting still had not. You develop a relationship with the trail that resembles the relationship a person develops with a long commute or a daily route to work, except that the commute is 2,190 miles long and your office is wherever you stop walking at the end of the day. I'd started at Springer Mountain in Georgia in late March with a pack that weighed too much and expectations that were both too specific and not specific enough, and I'd walked north through spring and summer and into early fall with the particular single-mindedness that a through hike requires, the daily commitment to covering distance that becomes less a decision and more a rhythm. The way breathing is a rhythm, something your body does because it has learned that this is what it does now. By October, I was in Vermont. The trail in Vermont is notoriously difficult. The terrain shifting from the graded, maintained paths of the mid-Atlantic to the kind of rocky, root-tangled, steep climbing and descending that slows your pace and punishes your joints and produces the particular exhaustion that comes from working hard for miles that don't accumulate the way they should. The Green Mountains in autumn are extraordinary. The color that the hardwood forests produce in early October at elevation is the kind of visual saturation that makes you stop and look even when you've been looking at beautiful things for 7 months and your capacity for being impressed has been compressed by repetition. But the beauty coexists with difficulty, and by the time I reached the section north of Killington, I was tired in the way that through hikers are tired in the 7th month. Not acutely but fundamentally, the fatigue seated in the architecture of the body rather than the surface of it. I should describe what overnight hiking looks like at that stage of a through hike, because the logistics matter. By month 7, you've refined your system to its essentials. You know exactly how long it takes you to set up camp, cook, eat, clean, and get into your sleeping bag. You know the window of light you have at different latitudes and different times of year. In early October in Vermont, that window closes around 6:30, and the darkness that follows is complete in a way that suburban or urban darkness never is. The kind of dark where your headlamp creates a tunnel of light, surrounded by a wall of nothing, and the world beyond that tunnel ceases to exist in any visual sense. You learn to navigate by headlamp. You learn to trust the white blazes painted on trees every few hundred feet. You learn the particular quality of trail under your boots by feel. The way the packed surface differs from the shoulder, and the shoulder differs from off-trail ground. The night I found the tent was October 8th. I remember the date because I'd logged it in my trail journal, which I kept with the consistency of someone who understood that 7 months of daily entries would become something worth having when the walk was over. I was hiking late, which was unusual for me, but not unprecedented. I'd pushed past my planned stopping point because the shelter I'd intended to reach had been full when I'd arrived at 4:30. 8 hikers already established on the platform with their gear, the particular crowding that popular shelters produce during peak foliage season. I decided to continue to the next shelter, which my guide listed as 42 miles further. I'd expected to arrive before full dark. The terrain had other ideas. The trail climbed steeply out of the hollow where the first shelter sat, gained a ridge, and then descended into a gap before climbing again. And the descents were the kind of rocky, technical footing that slows you to half your normal pace when you're navigating by headlamp. By 8:30, I'd covered perhaps 3 of the 42 miles, and I was walking in full dark with my headlamp on its medium setting, following the white blazes from tree to tree. The tent appeared in my headlamp beam at approximately 9:15. It was a small backpacking tent, the kind of single-person shelter that most thru-hikers carry, positioned not at a campsite or a clearing but in the middle of the trail, directly on the trail. The tent was set up so that the trail passed on either side of it, with maybe 2 feet of clearance on each side, as if whoever had placed it there had deliberately centered it on the path. The rain fly was on. The vestibule was zipped shut. No light came from inside. I stopped. The beam of my headlamp illuminated the tent in that flat, direct way that LED headlamps produce. The nylon fabric, showing the particular gray-green color, that several popular ultralight tent manufacturers use. It was a real tent. It was properly staked. The guy lines were taut and anchored to small rocks, placed at the correct angles. The work of someone who had set up this tent many times and who knew exactly how the process worked. The only thing wrong was the location. Not at a campsite, not at a clearing, not at a shelter on the trail, blocking it, positioned with a precision that communicated intention. I stood there for what was probably 2 minutes. I said hello. My voice sounded flat and small in the way that voices do in deep forest at night, absorbed by the trees and the damp air, and returned as nothing. No response. I said it again, louder. Nothing. No movement inside the tent. No rustle of a sleeping bag. No shift of a body. The silence from within the tent was the particular silence of an unoccupied space. The absence of the small sounds that a sleeping person makes. The breathing and the periodic movement and the tiny adjustments that happen even in deep sleep. I should have walked around it. The clearance on either side was enough to pass, and the brush beyond the trail's edge was passable if not comfortable. But I want to be honest about what I did, which was stand in the trail and look at this tent for long enough that the looking became its own kind of paralysis. The particular inability to act that comes from encountering something that doesn't fit any category you've built for the world you're in. Tents go at campsites. Tents go at shelters. Tents go at clearings and flat spots and the kind of locations that 7 months of hiking teach you to identify automatically. Tents do not go in the middle of the trail at 9:15 at night on a ridgeline in the Green Mountains with no campsite within a mile in either direction. I walked around it on the left side, pushing through the low brush and stepping carefully to avoid the guy lines as I passed. My headlamp swept across the tent's side panel, through the mesh interior, visible beneath the edge of the rainfly where it didn't quite reach the ground. I could see the floor of the tent. It was empty. No sleeping bag, no pad, no pack, no gear of any kind. Just the bare tent floor, the gray nylon ground sheet showing nothing on it. A tent set up with care and precision and staked properly and positioned in the center of the trail with nothing inside it. I reached the shelter at 10:20. It was empty. I set up on the platform and I did not sleep well, and I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds the forest made and not hearing footsteps or voices or anything that didn't belong. Just the wind and the settling dark and the particular quality of silence that a shelter has when you're the only person in it. In the morning, I packed up and hiked back south along the trail toward the tent. I wanted to see it in daylight. I wanted the confirmation that what I'd seen in the headlamp beam was what I thought I'd seen and not something rearranged by darkness and fatigue and the particular unreliability of perception that nighttime hiking produces. The tent was gone. The section of trail where it had been showed no evidence that anything had been there. No stake holes in the ground, no compression of the leaf litter where the floor had sat, no marks from the rocks that had anchored the guy lines. The trail was just trail. The same packed earth and scattered leaves and exposed roots that every other section of trail looked like, undisturbed and unremarkable. I stood there in the morning light and I looked at the ground and I tried to reconcile what I was seeing with what I had seen 10 hours earlier. The tent had been real. The stakes had been real. The empty interior visible through the mesh had been real. And now there was nothing. Not the absence of a tent that had been removed, but the absence of evidence that a tent had ever been there at all. I finished my thru hike 3 weeks later at Katahdin. I completed the logbook entry at the summit, and I took the photograph that thru hikers take. And I felt the things that thru hikers feel at the end of 7.5 months of walking. I have not told many people about the tent. The few I've told, other hikers mostly, have offered explanations that I've considered and found insufficient. A prank, someone suggests. Trail magic gone weird. A hiker who set up realized they were in the wrong spot and moved on. None of these explanations account for the empty interior. None of them account for the absence of ground evidence the next morning. None of them explain why someone would carry a tent into the Vermont backcountry set it up with perfect technique in the center of a trail at night, leave it empty and zipped shut, and remove it so completely that the ground showed no trace of its presence. The trail is still there, the white blazes are still painted on the trees, the shelters still fill with hikers in foliage season. And somewhere on a ridge in the Green Mountains there is a section of trail that I passed through once in the dark, and that looked completely ordinary in the daylight, and that I think about more than a stretch of dirt and roots should require. The tent was there, and then it wasn't, and I have no third sentence to put after those two that makes them make sense. My wife and I hiked the Appalachian Trail in segments across 5 years of weekends and vacation days. The kind of project that couples undertake when they share a specific interest, and when the interest is large enough to structure years of shared time around it without exhausting itself. We lived in Roanoke, which put us within driving distance of hundreds of miles of the Virginia section, and within reasonable weekend range of the sections in West Virginia and Tennessee and North Carolina that border it. Sarah had grown up hiking in the Blue Ridge with her father, the particular version of outdoor education that involves being handed a pack at age 8 and being told that complaining doesn't make the hill shorter. She knew the mountains the way people know things they learned as children, instinctively, bodily, the knowledge seated in muscle memory and spatial awareness rather than in maps and guidebooks. I'd come to hiking later, in my 20s, through the route that a lot of men in the Roanoke area come to it, which is through running trails first, and then realizing that the trails continue past the point where running them makes sense and that walking them produces a different kind of satisfaction. We'd been married 4 years when we started the project. The hiking was something we chose together, the particular version of a shared hobby that involves physical effort and planning and logistics, and that gives a marriage a structure of ongoing collaboration outside of the domestic and professional routines that constitute most of shared life. We kept a spreadsheet. Sarah maintained it with the organizational precision that her work as a data analyst had instilled in her. Each section logged with dates and mileage and conditions and the particular metrics that mattered to us: elevation, gain, water source reliability, shelter quality, the practical information that repeat hikers accumulate and that transforms unfamiliar terrain into known territory over time. By the time we reached the section I'm going to describe, we had completed roughly 600 miles across 3 states and had developed the particular communication shorthand that couples develop around a shared activity. We knew each other's pace and each other's habits, and each other's tolerance for discomfort, and each other's signals for when a day had been enough. We knew how to share a shelter platform without negotiation, and how to divide camp tasks without discussion, and how to walk in companionable silence for hours without either of us interpreting the silence as anything other than what it was. 2. People comfortable enough with each other and with the activity that conversation was optional rather than required. We had our systems, we had our routines. We had the particular confidence that comes from having done a thing many times in many conditions, and from knowing that the thing, while occasionally uncomfortable, was fundamentally safe and manageable and within the boundaries of what we could handle together. The section was in the Untitled National Forest in western North Carolina, a 3-day stretch that included 2 nights at trail shelters. We'd driven down from Roanoke on a Thursday evening and stayed at a motel in Bryson City, the kind of clean, unremarkable motel that trail towns in the southern Appalachians specialize in. The rooms smelling of cleaning solution and the parking lot showing cars with roof racks and hiking stickers, and the particular evidence of an economy built around people who come to walk in the mountains. We started on a Friday morning in late September. The weather was warm for the elevation, the kind of early autumn that the southern Appalachians produce when summer hasn't fully released its hold, and the mountains are green with just the first edges of color showing at the highest points, the sourwoods turning early and the tulip poplars beginning to yellow and the rest of the canopy still holding the deep green of late summer that would break into color within 2 weeks. We reached the first shelter by late afternoon. It was a standard AT shelter. 3 walls and a roof and a wooden platform and a fire ring, set back from the trail in a small clearing, bordered by hemlock and rhododendron, the rhododendron forming the dense, dark wall that it forms in the southern mountains, the leaves leathery and evergreen, and creating an understory so thick that it blocks sight lines beyond 10 or 15 feet. The shelter faced east. The clearing was maybe 40 feet. Across, the privy was a short walk uphill on a side trail, marked with a small wooden sign. We were the only ones there, which was not unusual for a Friday weekday, and Friday arrivals at less popular shelters often meant solitude. The weekend hikers not arriving until Saturday morning, if they arrived at all. We ate dinner and watched. The light changed the way it changes in the mountains in September. The particular transition from gold to amber to the deep blue dusk that precedes full dark in the hollows. The hollow where the shelter sat collected the dark early, the surrounding ridges cutting the last direct light by 6 o'clock and the ambient light fading through a gradual diminishment that turned the trees from distinct shapes into silhouettes and then into suggestions and then into nothing. We were in our sleeping bags on the platform by 8:30, which was early even for us, but the kind of early that felt natural. When the dark came down and the forest closed in and there was nothing to do, that sleep didn't serve better. Sarah fell asleep quickly, the way she always did on the trail, her body switching off with an efficiency that I envied, and that I attributed to the physical confidence she carried from a childhood spent in these mountains. She trusted the woods. She slept in them the way she slept in our bedroom in Roanoke. Completely and without reservation, I lay awake longer. Not from anxiety, but from the particular alertness that the first night in the woods produces, the body recalibrating to a different set of ambient sounds and a different quality of dark. I was nearly asleep when I heard the whispering. It came from behind the shelter, from the woods to the west, from the uphill side where the terrain rose steeply through hemlock and rhododendron into the ridge above. The sound was distinct from the wind and the settling forest noise and the small animal movements that the undergrowth produced at irregular intervals. It was a human voice. It was whispering, and it was saying Sarah's name. I want to be precise about this because precision matters, and because the alternative to precision is the kind of vague recounting that allows people to dismiss what I'm describing as wind noise or animal sound or the auditory pareidolia that the human brain produces when it's tired and in an unfamiliar environment. The voice was human. The word was Sarah, not a sound that resembled Sarah, not a syllable pattern that my brain interpreted as Sarah, the name, complete and clear, spoken in a whisper that was close enough to be heard distinctly through the open front of the shelter, and distant enough that I could not identify a direction more specific than the woods to the west. It was spoken twice, with a pause between the repetitions that was approximately the length of a breath. Sarah, and then again Sarah. I sat up on the platform. Sarah was asleep beside me, her breathing even undisturbed. I listened. The forest did what the forest does at night. The layered silence that isn't silence at all, but a composition of small sounds too numerous to separate. The wind moving through the hemlock canopy, and the occasional creak of a tree trunk, and the rustling of small animals in the leaf litter, and the distant, barely audible sound of the creek that ran through the hollow below the shelter. The whispering had stopped. I lay back down. I told myself the things you tell yourself when you hear something in the woods at night that you can't explain. The rational catalog of possibilities that the conscious mind produces to manage the part of the brain that is older and less interested in explanations. Wind through the rhododendron leaves can produce sounds that approximate speech. The hollow's acoustics could carry a sound from a distance and reshape it. My brain, tired and in a transitional state between waking and sleep, could have imposed a pattern on random noise. These are the explanations I offered myself. None of them were convincing. All of them were necessary. 20 minutes later it came again. This time it said my name, David. Whispered from the same direction, the same distance, the same quality of voice. The kind of whisper that carries further than it should in still air. The sibilants distinct, the vowels compressed, the name unmistakable. Not a sound that resembled. David, my name David, and then, after that same breath-length pause, Sarah, both names, spoken in sequence from the dark woods behind the shelter where the rhododendron wall blocked any view of whatever or whoever was producing the sound. I did not wake Sarah. I want to explain why, because the decision seems wrong in retrospect, and it seemed wrong at the time, and I made it anyway. I did not wake her because waking her would have required me to describe what I was hearing and describing. What I was hearing would have made it more real than I wanted it to be at 11 o'clock at night in a shelter in the Nantahala, with no one else around and no cell service and no way to address what was happening except to acknowledge it. I chose not to acknowledge it. I lay in my sleeping bag and I listened, and the whispering did not come again that night. I lay there for hours. I know because I watched the quality of the dark change from the absolute black of midnight to the first gray suggestion of approaching dawn, the transition so gradual that you can't identify the moment it begins, only the moment you realize it has been happening for a while. We had not told anyone on the trail our names. This is the detail that I return to when I think about that night, which is more often than I would choose. We had not encountered another hiker since the trailhead. The parking area where we'd left our car had been empty when we'd arrived. We had not signed the trail register, which I normally did, but which I had forgotten at the start of this section, and which Sarah had not reminded me to do because she was less committed to the logbook habit than I was. Our names were not on the shelter logbook because we hadn't written in it yet. Our names were on nothing accessible at that location to anyone who hadn't arrived with us or who hadn't followed us from somewhere where our names were known. We were Sarah and David to each other and to the friends and family who knew we were hiking that weekend. We were not Sarah and David to the forest or to anyone in it. In the morning I told Sarah. She listened with the particular stillness that she uses when she is processing something she doesn't want to process. The stillness that I've learned over years of marriage means she is taking something seriously and is deciding how seriously to take it. She asked me if I was sure. I said I was sure. She asked me if it could have been an animal. I said it could not have been an animal. She asked me what I wanted to do. I said I wanted to leave. She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't suggest that I'd been dreaming or that the forest plays tricks or that I should rationalize what I'd heard into something manageable. She nodded and she started packing her gear, and we hiked out to the trailhead by early afternoon, skipping the second night and the remaining section and driving back to Roanoke in a car that was quieter than usual. The particular quiet of two people sitting with something they cannot explain and have silently agreed not to try to explain while they are still close enough to the place where it happened that the explaining feels premature. We've been back to the trail since. We've completed other sections. We have not returned to that shelter in the Nantahala. I check the shelter logbooks when we stay at other shelters, reading the entries the way you read them when you're looking for something specific, scanning for anything unusual, for other hikers who might have heard something similar in the same area, for any entry that mentions whispers or voices or names spoken from the dark. I found nothing. The entries are what they always are. Names and dates and notes about water sources and weather and the particular ordinary observations that people make when they're doing something they love in a place that is beautiful and that they believe is safe. Sarah doesn't talk about it. I don't ask. The spreadsheet still has the Nantahala section listed with the dates and the mileage, and a note in the conditions column that says incomplete, left early, and that says nothing about why. The mountains hold what they hold, and the forest keeps what happens in it with the particular indifference that old places have toward the experiences of the people who pass through them. Someone or something knew our names that night in a hollow in western North Carolina where our names had no business being known, and we don't know how, and we don't go back. I was a section hiker for 6 years before I found the journal, and in those 6 years I had accumulated the kind of trail Knowledge that comes from repetition and attention and the particular investment that regular hikers make in understanding the systems and structures and informal culture of the Appalachian Trail. I was a middle school science teacher in Knoxville, Tennessee, and hiking was the thing I did with the portions of my life that teaching didn't occupy, the weekends and the summer weeks and the occasional long weekend when the school calendar aligned with good weather and manageable sections. I hiked alone mostly, which is a choice that produces a specific kind of experience, different from the social hiking that groups and couples do. More internal, more observational, more dependent on your own attention for both safety and satisfaction. Solo hiking is a practice of noticing. You notice things when you're alone that you don't notice in company. Because conversation occupies the part of the brain that would otherwise be processing the environment, cataloging the details, filing the small observations that accumulate into the kind of deep familiarity with a landscape that only solitude and repetition produce. The at in the Smokies is a different animal from the at in Virginia or New England. The Smokies section runs along the ridgeline of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, crossing peaks above 6,000 feet through forest. That is among the oldest and most biologically dense in North America. The old-growth spruce fir forest at elevation is the kind of forest that predates European settlement and that carries in its structure and its silence a quality that younger forests don't have, the particular weight of a place that has been what it is for longer than most things last. The trail in the park requires permits for overnight stays, and hikers are required to sleep at designated shelters rather than camping at large, which creates a system of scheduled stops and predictable flow that other sections of the trail don't have. You apply for permits in advance. You are assigned to specific shelters on specific nights. The Park Service tracks who is where and when. The particular institutional management that a national park applies to the problem of thousands of people wanting to walk through a wilderness that can only sustain so many of them at once. The shelters in the Smokies are substantial structures, many of them stone or heavy timber, with chain-link fronts that can be closed at night to keep bears out. The bear management is serious. The rules are enforced. The rangers patrol. You hang your food on cables suspended between trees, or you store it in the bear-proof boxes at the shelter sites. You don't cook in the shelter. You don't bring food into the shelter. The Smokies section of the ATA operates with a level of institutional structure that makes it feel managed in a way that the wilderness sections further north do not. There is a system. The system works, and the system creates an expectation that things within it will behave according to its rules, that what you encounter on the trail will fall within the categories that the system allows for, the blazes and the signs and the shelters and the other hikers and the wildlife that has been managed into a pattern of coexistence that, while not entirely predictable, operates within known parameters. I say all of this because the systems and structures matter when something falls outside of them. The journal I found was outside every system I knew. I was hiking a 4-day section. In mid-June, the early summer stretch when the rhododendron blooms at elevation and the ridgeline trails pass through tunnels of white and pink blossoms that arch over the path in a display that draws hikers from across the region for the 2 or 3 weeks that the bloom lasts. I was on my second day, moving north from Clingman's Dome toward the shelter at Trecorner Knob, covering the kind of high-elevation terrain that the Smokies specialize in. The trail running along narrow ridges with steep drops on both sides, and the cloud forest sitting just above the canopy, and the views stretching into the blue distance when the clouds broke and closing to a few hundred feet when the clouds settled back down, which they did frequently. The particular weather pattern of the high Smokies in summer being one of intermittent visibility and sudden fog, and the kind of moisture that doesn't fall as rain, but that hangs in the air as a mist that coats everything. In a thin film of water, the trail was well maintained and well marked. The white blazes freshly painted, the water bars and rock steps in good condition. the work of the maintaining club visible in the particular care that the Smokies section receives. I should mention that I carried a specific guidebook, the one that most 8 hikers in the Smokies carry, the WOL guide, and that I had studied the section in advance with the thoroughness that 6 years of section hiking had taught me was worth the effort. I knew the distances between shelters. I knew the elevation profile. I knew the water sources and their reliability, and the side trails that intersected the AT, and the points where the trail crossed from one drainage to another. I had a map in my pack and a second copy of the relevant pages folded in my hip belt pocket. I knew where I was at all times. This matters because what I found was positioned with a specificity that depended on knowing the trail and knowing where hikers heading north would be heading next. I found the journal at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, nailed to a red spruce tree roughly 6 feet off the ground on the right side of the trail. The nail was a common 16-penny framing nail, driven through the front cover of the journal and into the bark of the tree with enough force that the head of the nail was flush against the cover. The journal itself was a standard composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that you can buy at any drugstore for less than $2. The kind that students use in classrooms, and that I had seen thousands of in my career as a teacher. I recognized it immediately, the way you recognize things that are part of your professional environment when you encounter them outside of it. Seeing a composition notebook nailed to a spruce tree on the AT was the particular dissonance of finding a familiar object in an impossible context. It was not weathered. The cover was clean, the corners sharp, the binding intact. It had not been there long. The sap around the nail was fresh, the pale amber color that spruce sap shows before it oxidizes and darkens, which meant the nail had been driven within the last day or two. I pulled it free from the nail, which required some effort as the nail was well seated in the wood. The cover came away with a small hole where the nail had penetrated. I opened it. The first page was blank. The second page was blank. I turned pages, all blank. Clean white ruled pages with no writing, no marks, no water damage, no indication that the notebook had been used for anything. Every page was blank except one. Approximately halfway through the notebook, on a right-hand page, there was a single entry written in black ink in handwriting that was neat and deliberate and without flourish. Block letters, evenly spaced. The kind of handwriting that is designed to be read clearly rather than to express personality. The entry read, "Don't sleep at the next shelter." I stood on the trail holding the notebook, and I read the sentence 3 times. The next shelter on my route was Tricorner Knob, approximately 4 miles ahead, where I had a permit to stay that night. The sentence was unambiguous. It was not a riddle or a poem or a piece of trail art. The kind of creative expression that hikers occasionally leave along the trail in the form of cairns or painted rocks or notes tucked into trail registers. It was a directive, "Don't sleep at the next shelter," written in a notebook that had been nailed to a tree at a point on the trail where it would be encountered by northbound hikers headed for Tricorner Knob. The positioning was precise. The notebook was at eye level for a person of average height. The trail at that point was narrow, enough that you would pass within arm's reach of the tree. You couldn't miss it. I need to describe the decision I made, because the decision says something about the way experienced hikers think, and about the particular calculus that operates when you're alone in the backcountry and you encounter information that is ambiguous. In its origin and intention, the rational assessment was straightforward. Someone had placed this notebook here recently. The writing was clear and deliberate. The instruction was specific, but the instruction came with no context, no explanation, no identification of who had written it or why. It could have been a prank. The kind of thing that a bored hiker might do for the perverse satisfaction of imagining the reaction. It could have been trail theater, the particular kind of performance that some hikers engage in to create stories and experiences for others. It could have been a warning from someone who had experienced something at Tricorner Knob that warranted warning. A bear in the shelter, or a dangerous individual, or a structural problem with the building. And it could have been something else entirely, something I couldn't categorize because I had no information to categorize it with. The sentence sat in the middle of a blank notebook like a single data point without a graph, information without context, a fact without a framework to interpret it. I kept the notebook. I hiked to Tricorner Knob. I arrived at the shelter at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon. The shelter was empty. The fire ring was cold. The ashes undisturbed, the charcoal fragments showing no sign of recent use. The logbook showed entries from 2 days prior, a group of 3 hikers who had noted nothing unusual. Just trail conditions and water source locations, and the kind of practical information that logbook entries typically contain. The shelter itself was in normal condition, the stone walls solid, the chain link front functional, the sleeping platform clean and dry. The bare cables hanging from their poles with the counterweight bags swaying slightly in the breeze. I set up my sleeping bag. I cooked dinner on my stove at the cooking area 50 yards from the shelter, following the bare protocol, the routine that the park requires and that 6 years of hiking had made automatic. I ate, I cleaned up. I sat on the edge of the platform as the light began to change, and I looked at the forest, and I looked at the notebook in my hands, and I read the sentence again, and I decided to stay because I had a permit and because the shelter was dry and because the alternative was hiking 4 additional miles in fading light to a campsite I wasn't sure existed, and because I was a rational person who made decisions based on evidence, and the evidence was a single sentence in a drugstore notebook nailed to a tree by someone I didn't know. I slept at the shelter. Nothing happened. I want to say that plainly because plainly is the only honest way to say it. Nothing happened during the night. No sounds that didn't belong. No visitors, no disturbance of any kind. The forest was quiet in the way the forest is quiet at elevation in the Smokies. The deep silence of old growth and altitude and distance from roads and towns, and the particular humming baseline of civilized noise that you only realize you've been hearing your entire life when it's absent. I slept well. I woke to clear skies and birdsong and the morning light that comes into an east-facing shelter in a way that fills the space gradually and completely. I packed up and hiked out, and I completed the section over the next 2 days without incident, and I drove home to Knoxville with the notebook on the passenger seat of my car. Here is what I think about. I think about the fact that the notebook had only 1 entry on 1 page in the middle of the book. Not the first page, which is where you would write if you were writing a note for someone to find when they opened. The cover, the middle, as if the placement within the notebook mattered. As if the person who wrote it wanted the reader to turn pages, to experience the blankness before reaching the words, to feel the accumulation of empty pages as a kind of preparation for the sentence that was coming. I think about the fact that the handwriting was controlled, and even the handwriting of someone who was calm when they wrote it, who was not rushed or frightened or emotional, but who was doing something they had planned to do and were executing with care. I think about the fact that someone carried a framing nail into the Smokies backcountry. You don't carry a framing nail by accident. A framing nail is not a piece of gear that ends up in your pack the way a spare carabiner or an extra stuff sack does. A framing nail is a deliberate addition to your load. It serves one purpose, and whoever carried it knew what that purpose was before they left the trailhead. Nothing happened at the shelter. That's the true statement. But the true statement exists alongside another statement that is also true, which is that I don't know what happened at Tricorner Knob before I arrived, or what happened after I left, or what happened on the nights that fell between the last logbook entry and my arrival. I don't know who wrote in that notebook. I don't know if the warning was for me specifically, or for anyone heading north, or for a particular person the writer expected to pass that point on that day. I don't know if the danger that the sentence referenced was real, or imagined, or invented. I don't know if the person who nailed the notebook to the tree did so because they had experienced something, or because they intended to cause something, or because the act itself, the nailing and the writing and the leaving, was the entire point. The notebook is in a drawer in my apartment in Knoxville. I kept it the way you keep things that you don't know what to do with. The way you keep evidence of something that may not have been anything but that you can't bring yourself to throw away because throwing it away feels like deciding it didn't matter. My students sometimes ask me about the AT because they know I hike and because middle schoolers are curious about what their teachers do outside of the classroom. I tell them about the views and the shelters and the particular satisfaction of covering distance on foot. I don't tell them about the notebook. I don't tell them that somewhere in the Great Smoky Mountains, someone nailed a warning to a tree in a blank composition book of the kind that sits in stacks in my supply closet, and that I hand out on the first day of every school year. And caring that much about anything, carrying a nail into the backcountry and driving it into a spruce tree and leaving a single sentence in a blank book for a stranger to find, is either a warning or a threat, and I haven't figured out which. And 6 years of trail knowledge and 20 years of teaching and a lifetime of believing that things have explanations have not helped me figure it out. The man appeared for the first time at McAfee Knob, which is the most photographed point on the entire Appalachian Trail, and which, because of that distinction, draws enough foot traffic on a clear October Saturday that encountering strangers there is not just expected, but inevitable. I need to establish this because what made the man remarkable was not his presence at McAfee Knob, but the pattern that his presence revealed over the course of a day that covered 12 miles and 4 overlooks, and that ended with me sitting in my car in the parking lot at the Route 311 trailhead, with the doors locked and my hands not quite steady on the steering wheel. I was 34. I worked as a veterinary technician at a small animal practice in Salem, Virginia. The kind of practice that handles routine wellness visits and dental cleanings and the particular emergencies that pet owners produce when their animals eat something they shouldn't have on a Sunday evening. I'd been at the practice for 7 years. I liked the work and I liked the animals and I liked the daily rhythm of appointments and procedures and the particular satisfaction of a job where the outcomes are usually good and the gratitude is usually genuine. I hiked alone on weekends, which was a habit I developed after my divorce 2 years earlier. The particular replacement activity that fills the hours that used to be filled by the routines of shared life. Saturday mornings that had once involved grocery shopping with another person, and Sunday afternoons that had once involved the particular domestic negotiation of what to watch or where to eat now involved lacing up boots and driving to a trailhead and walking until the walking had used up enough of the day that going home felt like a natural next step rather than a retreat to an empty apartment. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it establishes why I was alone on the trail, and why being alone on the trail was something I'd become comfortable with in a way that I might not have been during the years when solitude was not my default state. And I say it because women who hike alone develop a specific awareness that needs to be described plainly rather than dramatically. This is not a statement about living in fear. It is a practical observation about the particular attention that solitary women in outdoor spaces learn to maintain. The background processing that runs continuously and that monitors the environment for the patterns that indicate safety and the patterns that don't. You learn to notice who is on the trail and where they are relative to you and whether their behavior fits the patterns that normal trail use produces. You do this automatically, the way you check your mirrors when you're driving, not because you expect a collision, but because the habit of checking is the thing that keeps you safe. If a collision is coming, you note faces, you note distances, you note pacing, and you note when something changes. When a face appears where it shouldn't, or a distance closes in a way that doesn't match the normal dynamics of trail traffic. McAfee Knob was crowded, Saturday in peak foliage, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-50s. The kind of day that brings everyone from Roanoke and Blacksburg and the New River Valley and the surrounding areas out to the overlooks with their cameras and their dogs and their groups of friends in matching university sweatshirts. I reached the overlook at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. Having started from the Route 311 parking area at 8:30, the rock outcropping was full of people sitting on the edge, standing in line for the photograph, eating snacks, pointing at landmarks. In the valley below, the particular controlled chaos that a famous overlook produces on a perfect day. I'd been to McAfee a dozen times. I knew the crowd. I knew the rhythm. I sat down on a rock away from the main cluster, ate an apple, and looked at the Catawba Valley below, the farms and the roads, and the tiny shapes of buildings in the distance. The view that has been photographed so many times that seeing it in person produces the strange sensation of recognizing something you've never actually stood in front of before. The man was sitting on a rock approximately 30 feet from me, slightly uphill, facing in my direction. He was average in every respect that I could catalog at that distance. Average height, average build, brown or dark hair. Wearing a gray fleece jacket and khaki hiking pants and boots that looked neither new nor old. He was alone. He was not eating or drinking or taking photographs or consulting a map or checking a phone or doing any of the things that people do. At Overlooks, he was sitting. He was looking in my direction. When I looked at him, he did not look away. Not the natural glance and redirect that people do when accidental eye contact occurs in public space. He held the look, steady, unhurried. Without expression, I assigned this no significance. A crowded overlook. People sit. People look around. Eye contact happens, and most of the time it means nothing because most of the time people are just existing in public space, the way people exist in public space. I finished my apple, took a photograph of the valley, and continued north on the trail toward Tinker Cliffs. The trail between McAfee Knob and Tinker Cliffs runs along the ridgeline through open woods and occasional rock outcroppings. The terrain rolling but not difficult. The kind of hiking that allows a steady pace and a clear head, and the particular meditative quality that ridge walking produces when the views are long and the weather is fair. I was thinking about nothing in particular. I was enjoying the color, the maples and oaks along the ridge, showing the deep reds and oranges that the Blue Ridge produces in mid-October when the conditions are right. The kind of color that justifies every use of the word spectacular, and that still manages to exceed the word when you're standing in the middle of it. Tinker Cliffs is approximately 4 miles further along the ridgeline from McAfee Knob, Tinker. Cliffs is less crowded because it requires more hiking to reach, the kind of natural filtration that distance produces, where the casual visitors turn back and the committed hikers continue. I reached Tinker Cliffs at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon. There were perhaps a dozen people spread along the cliff edge, far fewer than McAfee Knob, the atmosphere quieter. The particular stillness that a more remote overlook is compared to a popular one. I found a spot, sat down, drank water, and looked at the view, which faces a different direction than McAfee and shows a different section of the valley. The Catawba Creek drainage and the farmland beyond it, and the ridges receding into the blue haze that gives the mountains their name. The man was there, same gray fleece, same khaki pants, same position relative to me, slightly uphill, roughly 30 feet away, same orientation, facing me, same stillness, no food, no water bottle, no camera, no phone. Sitting on a rock and looking at me with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who is doing exactly what they intend to be doing, and who has no interest in pretending otherwise. I felt the first edge of something then. Not fear exactly, recognition, the particular cognitive shift that happens when a coincidence occurs a second time and stops being a coincidence and starts being a pattern. 4 miles of trail between McAfee Knob and Tinker Cliffs. He had covered the same distance I had. He had arrived before me or shortly after. He had positioned himself in the same relative location. The same distance, the same angle, the same orientation, and he was watching me again. Not glancing, watching. The kind of sustained, purposeful attention that does not occur accidentally and that, when you become aware of it, changes the quality of every space you share with the person producing it. I left Tinker Cliffs and continued north. I walked faster than my usual pace. The trail from Tinker descends through a series of switchbacks before crossing a gap and climbing to a smaller Overlook that doesn't have an official name, but that hikers call the Hay Rock for the large rock formation that marks it. I reached it at approximately 2:40, fewer people, maybe 5 or 6. The man was there, gray fleece, 30 feet away, watching. 3 overlooks, same man, same distance, same behavior. The rational explanations were available, and I cycled through them with the deliberate, systematic attention that I apply to diagnostic puzzles at the clinic. The process of listing possibilities and testing them against evidence. He was hiking the same section I was. He was faster than me and arrived first. He liked overlooks. He was a quiet person who didn't engage with strangers. These are all possible. Each explanation was individually plausible. Each explanation failed to account for the consistency of his positioning. The way he chose a spot that was always the same approximate distance from me, and always oriented so that he was facing me directly. The same 30 feet, the same slight elevation above my position, the same unwavering attention. People don't do that accidentally 3 times across 12 miles. People who are coincidentally hiking the same trail don't triangulate their rest positions relative to a specific stranger. At every stop with the precision of a surveyor establishing a benchmark. I turned around. I did not continue to the 4th overlook. I turned around and hiked south, back the way I'd come, back toward the parking area at Route 311. I hiked faster than my normal pace. I did not stop at the overlooks on the return. I passed McAfee Knob without pausing. I reached the parking lot at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. The lot fuller than it had been in the morning. The weekend hikers' cars filling the spaces and lining the shoulder of the road. I walked to my car and I unlocked it and I got inside and I locked the doors and I sat there with my hands on the wheel. And I looked at the parking lot and I waited for my breathing to slow to something that felt normal. He was in the parking lot. He was standing next to a vehicle 3 rows from mine. A dark-colored SUV, a Chevy Tahoe or something similar, that I hadn't noticed on my way in that morning. He was not getting in the vehicle. He was not loading gear. He was not arranging his pack or changing his boots or doing any of the things that hikers do when they return to the parking lot. He was standing beside it, facing my car, with his hands at his sides and the same expression that wasn't an expression, the blank, steady, neutral face of someone who is looking at you with full attention and no readable emotion, and who wants you to know that they are looking. I started my car. I drove out of the parking lot. I watched my rearview mirror for the entire drive down Route 311 to the interstate. I did not see the dark SUV behind me. I took an indirect route home, turns I don't normally take. The instinctive evasive behavior that isn't something anyone teaches you, but that you do anyway because the part of your brain that handles threat response has decided that unpredictability is safer than routine. I drove to Salem and I parked in my apartment complex and I went inside and I locked my door and I checked my windows and I sat on my couch and I did not call the police because I did not know what I would report. A man looked at me at 4 locations on a popular hiking trail. He didn't speak, he didn't approach, he didn't threaten, he didn't gesture. He existed in the same public spaces I existed in, and he looked at me. The law has nothing to say about looking. The law has no category for a man who watches you from exactly 30 feet away at every overlook on a 12-mile hike and who stands beside his car in a parking lot and watches you drive away. I went back to McAfee Knob 2 weeks later with a friend, a woman I worked with at the clinic who hiked occasionally and who agreed to come without my explaining fully why I wanted company. The man was not there. He has not been there on any subsequent hike. I have not seen him again. I have looked at every overlook, at every trailhead, at every parking lot. I scanned the faces the way I scan the trail, automatically, habitually, looking for the gray fleece and the steady eyes and the particular stillness of a person who is not doing anything except watching and who wants you to know it. The Blue Ridge holds its overlooks the way it has always held them, the rock outcroppings, facing the valley and the valley stretching out below, and the light changing across it in the way that light changes across Virginia valleys in October. The shadows lengthening and the color deepening and the ridges going blue and then purple and then dark. And I still hike, and I still hike alone sometimes, though less often than I did before, and never on that section, and never without telling someone exactly where I'll be and exactly when I expect to be back. Alone means something different to me now. Alone means checking. Alone means looking at every face at every overlook and measuring every distance and noting every person who sits still when everyone else is moving. Alone means carrying the knowledge that someone once watched me with that kind of attention for that many miles, and that I will never know why, and that not knowing is the thing I take with me to every trailhead and bring home from every hike, and have not, in 2 years, been able to leave on the trail where it belongs. There were 5 of us on that trip, which was the most we'd ever taken into the backcountry together, and which, in retrospect, is the detail that makes what happened hardest to explain, because 5 sets of eyes and 5 sets of ears, and 5 people sleeping within 10 feet of each other should have been enough to notice someone moving through a campsite in the dark. We were all in our late 20s and early 30s, all of us working in some version of the outdoor industry in around Asheville, North Carolina. And all of us had been hiking together in various combinations for 4 or 5 years before this trip. The kind of group that forms around shared geography and shared interest and the particular social ecosystem that Asheville produces, where people who work at breweries and gear shops and guiding companies and environmental nonprofits find each other through the inevitable overlap of communities that are small enough to be interconnected and outdoors oriented, enough that the trails become the common ground that everything else organizes around. I should describe the group because the group matters. Marcus worked at a climbing gym in South Asheville and had the particular physical ease of someone whose job involves movement and whose body has been shaped by years of pulling itself up walls. Jean was a river guide on the French Broad during season and bartended at a brewery the rest of the year. The particular dual employment that outdoor industry workers in Asheville manage with the seamlessness of people who have accepted that a single job rarely covers the rent in a town where the cost of living has outpaced the wages that outdoor work pays. Colton managed the gear department at a local outfitter and knew more about equipment than anyone I'd ever met. The kind of person who could identify a tent by the sound of its zipper, and who could tell you the year a pack was manufactured by the stitching pattern on the hip belt. And Allie was finishing a master's in ecology at UNC Asheville and brought the scientific perspective to everything. The tendency to identify plants by their Latin names and to explain the geological history of whatever ridge we happen to be standing on, and to interpret the forest in the particular language of someone who has been trained to see systems and relationships where the rest of us see trees. I was a graphic designer working freelance from a studio apartment in West Asheville, and my contribution to the group was mostly logistical. The planning and the route selection and the driving coordination that someone in every hiking group ends up doing because they're the one who finds satisfaction in spreadsheets and timetables and the particular pleasure of a well-organized itinerary. The trip was a 3-night section on the 8 in the Roan Highlands, the stretch of trail that crosses the high balds along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. I need to explain the Roan Highlands because the landscape matters to the story in ways that go beyond scenery. The Roan Highlands are unlike most of the Appalachian Trail. The balds are treeless summits covered in grass and rhododendron and wild blueberry. The particular ecological anomaly of high-elevation grasslands that should, by all rights, be forested, but that have been open for as long as anyone can document. The explanations for their existence ranging from Native American land management to soil chemistry to patterns of ice and wind that prevent tree establishment. The balds produce views that extend in every direction without the interruption of forest. The kind of open, exposed landscape that feels more like Scotland or the high moors than the typical closed canopy hiking that the AT in the southeast is known for. The wind on the balds is constant, the weather changes fast, the sky is enormous, and the camping is exposed and dramatic and beautiful in a way that draws hikers from across the region for the particular experience of sleeping on top of a mountain, with nothing between you and the stars except whatever your tent is made of. We started from Carver's Gap on a Thursday in early September. The weather was clear. The temperature at the Gap was in the low 60s and would drop into the 40s at night. The particular temperature range that early September at 6,000 feet produces in the southern highlands, warm enough to hike in a t-shirt and cool enough that the sleeping bags you packed had better be rated for what the night was actually going to do. We hiked out along the bald in a loose group, the trail running through open grass with the views opening up on both sides. The Blue Ridge extending to the east in layered ridges fading to blue, and the Tennessee Valley extending to the west in a broad, hazy expanse, and the sky enormous above us in the way that sky is enormous when trees aren't framing it, the particular vertigo of open air above and open land below, and the trail running along the spine of the mountain between them. We made camp that first night at a designated site just below one of the balds, a flat area with a fire ring and room for multiple tents, sheltered from the wind by a stand of spruce and rhododendron that bordered the clearing on three sides. The spruce grove was dark and dense, the trees old enough to have developed the particular gnarled, wing-shaped character that high-elevation spruce develops over decades of exposure. The trunks twisted and the branches reaching in the direction that the prevailing wind pushes them, and the canopy forming a wall that blocked both the wind and the view beyond the camp. We set up 3 tents, Marcus and Colton sharing one, Jean and Allie sharing another, and me in my solo tent, the arrangement that had become standard for our group, and that placed the 3 tents in a rough triangle around the fire ring with the openings facing inward toward the center of the camp. This was not deliberate architecture. This was the way 5 people who have camped together many times arrange themselves in a space, optimizing for conversation and fire access, and the particular social geometry that a group naturally produces when they're settling in for the evening. We cooked dinner, we sat around the fire, we talked about the things that hiking groups talk about when the day has been good and the weather is cooperating and the fire is producing the particular warmth and light that makes the surrounding darkness feel like a wall rather than a space. The darkness held at bay rather than pressing in. The conversation ranged through trail conditions and work complaints and the particular gossip and inside references that 5 years of friendship produce and that make a group conversation unintelligible to an outsider and completely natural to everyone involved. We stayed up later than usual because the sky was clear and the stars above the bald were the kind of dense, brilliant display that you only see at elevation in places where the nearest significant light source is 30 miles away. The Milky Way visible not as a suggestion, but as a structure, a band of light with depth and texture and the particular granularity that you never see from anywhere that has a street light. We went to bed around 11 o'clock. I heard the others settling into their tents. The sounds of sleeping bags being zipped and pads being adjusted, and the quiet conversations that couples have in tents before sleep. The murmured exchange that is too soft to hear the words of, and that you recognize by its rhythm and its tone as the particular intimacy of 2 people talking in a small space before they stop talking and fall asleep. And then the camp went quiet, and I lay in my sleeping bag and I listened to the wind moving across the bald above us and the particular settling sounds that a spruce grove makes at night, the creaking and the small movements of branches and the occasional sound of a cone falling, and I fell asleep. I woke to Jun's voice. It was early. The light was the pale gray of just after dawn. The sun not yet above the ridge, but the sky bright enough to illuminate the camp in the flat, shadowless way that pre-dawn light produces. Everything visible, but nothing casting a shadow. The world rendered in the particular monochrome that precedes The moment when the sun clears the ridge and color returns. Jeanne was standing outside her tent in her sleeping bag liner. Looking at the fire ring, she said my name. I unzipped my tent and looked out. Our boots were arranged in a circle around the fire ring. All 5 pairs, 10 boots, placed sole down in a perfect circle around the stone ring, evenly spaced, each pair touching. The left boot and the right boot of each pair placed side by side. With the toes pointing outward, away from the fire ring, the heels toward it, the circle was precise, the spacing was even. As if someone had measured the distances between each pair with a tape measure or a length of cord. The boots had been removed from the vestibules of our tents, where each of us had placed them before going to sleep, which was the standard practice. The universal habit that hikers develop of keeping boots in the vestibule, where they stay dry and accessible, and where you can find them in the dark if you need them. Marcus was awake now, and Colton and Allie. We stood around the fire ring in our camp shoes and our sleeping bag liners, and we looked at the boots and we looked at each other, and the looking produced no answers. 5 pairs of boots removed from them. 3 tents arranged in a circle that none of us had arranged. Marcus asked if anyone had gotten up during the night. No one had. Colton asked if anyone had heard anything. Any zipper, any footstep, any movement in the camp after we'd gone to sleep. No one had. Allie asked the question that I was thinking but hadn't said, which was whether someone from outside our group could have come through the campsite during the night, and the question hung in the morning air with the particular weight of a question that doesn't have a good answer regardless of which way you answer it. If someone had come through the camp, they had entered 3 tents, removed 5 pairs of boots, arranged them in a measured circle, and left without waking anyone. If no one had come through the camp, then one of us had done it in our sleep, which required the same sequence of actions, executed unconsciously. I want to describe the vestibule situation because it matters. My tent's vestibule zips from the inside. The zipper has a small fabric pull tab that makes noise when it's moved. The particular sound of nylon on nylon that is distinct and recognizable, and that I have heard thousands of times over years of camping. To remove my boots from my vestibule, someone would have had to unzip the vestibule from the outside, reach in past the rainfly, remove both boots, and rezip it. The vestibule was zipped when I woke up. I'd checked, instinctively, the way you check things that should be a certain way before you fully process that something is wrong. Zipped. The other tents showed the same. Vestibules zipped closed. Boots gone from inside them. The tents sealed and the boots in the circle, and no obvious mechanism connecting the 2 states of affairs. We checked the perimeter of the campsite. The ground around the clearing was soft from recent rain, the kind of ground that shows footprints. Clearly, the compressed leaf litter and the damp earth holding the impression of anything heavier than a squirrel. We found our own footprints from the previous evening, the various tread patterns of 5 pairs of hiking boots moving around the fire ring in between the tents and to the water source and back. We found no other prints, no prints that didn't belong to us, no prints leading into or out of the campsite, from the trail or from the woods or from any direction. Just ours, overlapping and crisscrossing in the patterns that a group of friends produces when they're setting up camp and cooking dinner and walking between the fire and their tents and moving around a space that 5 people share for an evening. We put our boots on, we packed up, we hiked the remaining 2 days and completed the section, and we drove back to Asheville, and we went to our separate apartments and jobs and routines. We have talked about it many times since, in the way that groups talk about things they can't explain. The conversation circling back to the same questions, and the same absence of answers, and the same uncomfortable silence that follows when someone offers an explanation and the rest of the group considers it and finds it lacking. Sleepwalking is the most common theory. One of us did it unconsciously, but one of us would have had to visit 3 tents, operate 3 different vestibule zippers with different configurations, remove 5 pairs of boots, carry them to the fire ring, and arrange them in a measured circle with even spacing and consistent orientation in total darkness, without waking anyone, including themselves, and then return to their tent and zip their own vestibule closed from the inside, and remember none of it. Animals is another theory. Raccoons or bears attracted to the salt in the leather or the sweat in the insoles. But no animal arranges 10 boots in an even circle with the toes pointing uniformly outward. A stranger passing through is another. But a stranger left no footprints and operated 3 unfamiliar tent vestibules silently and chose to do nothing except rearrange footwear. I still camp on the Balds. I still love the Roan Highlands, the wind and the open sky, and the views that reach the horizon, and the particular feeling of sleeping on top of a mountain where the world drops away in every direction. But I put my boots inside my tent now, not in the vestibule, inside, next to my sleeping bag, where I can feel them if I reach down in the dark, and where removing them would require unzipping the tent itself and reaching past my body and doing so without waking me, which is a thing I do not believe anyone could do. And every morning when I wake up in the backcountry, the first thing I do before I unzip the tent is reach down and check that they're still there. They always are, but the check-in has become part of the routine, the permanent alteration of behavior that comes from waking up one September morning on a bald in the Roan Highlands and finding that the things you left in one place have been moved to another place by a process that 5 people and the campsite itself have refused to explain. I am a trail runner, which is a different thing from being a hiker, and the difference matters to what happened because trail runners interact with the landscape at a speed and with a sensory focus that hikers don't share. When you're running trails, you process the ground differently. Your eyes are scanning 2 to 3 strides ahead continuously, reading the surface for roots and rocks and grade changes, and the particular hazards that mountain trails produce at the speed that running requires. Your hearing shifts. You stop hearing the forest as a collection of individual sounds and start hearing it as a texture, a baseline against which changes register immediately. The snap of a branch or the flush of a bird or the sound of something moving at a pace that doesn't match the ambient rhythm. You become, over years of practice, an instrument tuned to detect anomaly, and you do this at 7 or 8 miles an hour through terrain that is constantly changing under your feet. Trail runners develop a particular relationship with surfaces. You know the sound of your own footfalls on dirt, on rock, on root, on mud, on gravel, on pine needle, on wet leaves. Each surface has an acoustic signature that you learn without studying and that you recognize without thinking about it. You know what you're running on by the sound your shoes make, the way a musician knows a note by its pitch. I ran trails in the southern Appalachians of North Carolina out of Brevard, where I lived and worked as a physical therapist at a sports medicine clinic that served a clientele made up largely of runners and cyclists and climbers. The particular patient population that a town at the edge of the Pisgah National Forest produces. Brevard sits in a valley surrounded by mountains that hold some of the best trail running in the southeast. The trails climbing from the valley floor at 2,200 feet to ridgelines above 5,000 feet through forest that ranges from the lush cove hardwoods of the lower elevations to the spruce and fir of the high peaks. I ran 4 or 5 mornings a week before work with the kind of regularity that makes running less an activity and more a structural element of daily life, the thing around which the other things organize themselves. My alarm went off at 5:45. I was on the trail by 6:15. I ran for 60 to 90 minutes depending on the route. I was showered and at the clinic by 8:30. This was the rhythm. This was the architecture of my days, built on a foundation of trail and effort and the particular satisfaction that comes from starting every day with something difficult and physical and solitary. I knew the trails the way a commuter knows roads. I knew the surfaces and the grades, and the seasonal conditions, and the particular way the light changed at different times of year, at different points on different trails. I knew which sections flooded after rain, and which sections dried fastest, and where the ice formed first in November, and where the wildflowers appeared first in April. I knew the trails as well as I knew any physical space in my life, better than my apartment, better than the clinic, with the kind of intimate, bodily knowledge that comes from moving through a space thousands of times at a speed that requires you to pay attention to every square foot of it. The section of trail I need to describe runs along a ridge above the Davidson River and passes, at approximately mile 3 of my usual morning loop, a small cemetery. The cemetery is old. The stones date to the mid-1800s. The inscriptions weathered to the point where most of them require effort to read. The names and dates softened by 150 years of rain and freeze-thaw, and the particular erosion that mountain weather applies to anything that stands still long enough. The cemetery sits in a small clearing on the uphill side of the trail, enclosed by a low stone wall that has collapsed in places, the wall holding its shape in the way that dry stacked stone holds shape, gradually, imperfectly, the stones settling and shifting, but maintaining the essential outline of what they were built to enclose. The graves are marked with a mix of carved headstones and simpler fieldstone markers, some upright, some tilted, some flat on the ground where they've fallen and been left because the people who would have righted them are themselves buried somewhere, and the cemetery has no one maintaining it except the seasons and the slow work of moss. There are perhaps 30 graves. The clearing is shaded by old oaks that have grown since the last burial, and that now canopy the entire site in a cover dense enough that the ground beneath stays damp and mossy, even in dry weather. I passed this cemetery 3 or 4 times a week for 6 years. It was a landmark on my loop, the point where I knew I was at mile 3 and where I sometimes checked my pace on my watch, and where the trail widened briefly before narrowing again. As it continued along the ridge, the cemetery was quiet and unremarkable, and it sat in its clearing, being old, and being a cemetery, and being the particular kind of historical remnant that the southern Appalachians hold in abundance. The evidence of lives lived in these mountains before the National Forest existed and before the trails were trails, and before the land was anything other than the place where families farmed and prayed and buried their dead within sight of the ridges that had framed their entire existence. The run I need to describe was on a Tuesday in late October. I'd started at 6:15 in the morning, which put me on the trail in the pre-dawn gray. The light sufficient for trail running but not for detail, the world rendered in the monochrome that precedes sunrise when the sky is bright enough to see by, but the sun hasn't yet added color to anything. The air was cold, mid-30s, and my breath showed in the headlamp beam for the first mile before the effort warmed me enough that I stopped noticing the temperature. I reached the cemetery section at approximately 6:40. The trail at that point runs along the edge of the clearing, the stone wall on my right maybe 15 feet away. The slope down to the Davidson River on my left. I was moving at my usual pace, roughly a 7.5-minute mile, which on trail translates to a pace that is fast enough to feel like running and slow enough to manage the technical footing. Without falling, as I passed the cemetery, I heard footsteps behind me on gravel. The sound was distinct and unmistakable, the particular crunch and scatter of feet on loose stone, the compression and release that gravel makes when weight lands on it and lifts off, the small rocks shifting against each other under the pressure of a step. The sound was close, perhaps 20 feet behind me, and it was keeping pace with my running stride. The footfalls matching mine in rhythm, though not in exact timing. The slight offset of someone walking while I was running, the steps coming at a walking cadence but maintaining the same distance. I need to explain why this sound was wrong, because the wrongness is specific and technical, and it is the entire point. The trail at the cemetery section is pat dirt with exposed roots and occasional embedded rock. There is no gravel. The trail has never had gravel on this section. I have run this section over 1,000 times. The trail maintenance in the Pisgah is done by the local trail association and the Forest Service, and the surface management involves water bars and check dams and erosion control, not gravel application. The cemetery itself has no gravel paths. The graves are accessed by walking on grass and moss, and the bare ground between the stones. There are no gravel drives, no gravel walks, no gravel surfaces, no gravel anywhere. Within the clearing or along the section of trail that borders it, the sound of footsteps on gravel was the sound of someone walking on a surface that did not exist at that location. I slowed, the footsteps slowed. I stopped, the footsteps stopped. I stood on the trail at the edge of the cemetery in the pre-dawn. Gray with my heart rate elevated from running and my breathing audible, and I listened with the full attention that 6 years of trail running had trained me to focus. The forest was doing what the forest does in late October at dawn. The sparse birdsong of species that haven't migrated yet, and the wind in the bare canopy, and the distant sound of the Davidson River in the valley below. No footsteps, no gravel. I turned around. The trail behind me was empty. The cemetery was still. The stones stood in their rows, and the oaks held what remained of their canopy, and nothing moved in the clearing, or on the trail, or in the woods flanking either side. I started running again. Within 30 seconds the footsteps resumed, behind me, on gravel, the same distance, the same walking pace, the crunch and shift of loose stone under feet that were walking on a surface I could not see, and that was not there. I ran faster, the footsteps matched, the walking cadence somehow maintaining distance despite my increasing speed. I ran the remaining mile and a half to the trailhead at the fastest pace I could sustain on technical terrain in dim light, and the footsteps stayed behind me for every step, matching every acceleration, maintaining the same 20-foot distance. The sound of gravel under feet on a trail. That is dirt and root and rock, and that has never in the time I've known it been anything else. The footsteps stopped when I reached the parking area. The transition was abrupt, trail to asphalt, and the footsteps simply ceased. The way a sound ceases when its source is removed, not fading out but ending, a hard cutoff. The particular silence of something that was there and then wasn't. I stood in the parking lot, bent over with my hands on my knees, and my heart rate at a number that had nothing to do with the exertion, and I listened. Birds, wind, the river. The morning sounds of the Piga beginning, no gravel, no footsteps. The boundary between the trail and the pavement had functioned like a wall that sound could not cross. I went back the next morning. I am a person who goes back, which is either a character trait or a character flaw, and I have not determined which. I ran the same route at the same time. I passed the cemetery at approximately the same pace. Nothing, silence. The trail was trail, and the cemetery was cemetery, and the forest was forest, and nothing followed me, and no gravel sounded under invisible feet. I ran the route the following morning, and the morning after that, and every morning that week. Nothing. It happened again 3 weeks later. The same section, the same sound, the same 20 feet, the same pace matching. I stopped and the footsteps stopped, and I turned around and the trail was empty, and I started running, and the footsteps started, and I ran to the trailhead, and they stopped at the asphalt. Same pattern, same conditions, same impossible sound on an impossible surface. I still run that trail. I still pass the cemetery 3 or 4 times a week. The footsteps have occurred 4 more times in the 2 years since that first October morning. Always in late fall, always in the pre-dawn gray. Always at the cemetery section, always behind me. Always on gravel that isn't there. I've stopped trying to explain it. I've looked into the cemetery's history at the local historical society. The families buried there were farming families from the hollow below, Scotch-Irish mostly, the particular demographic that settled these mountains in the early 1800s, and that worked the land and built the walls and laid the paths between the graves where they visited the dead. Whether there were gravel paths once, laid along the graves and between the stones before the forest reclaimed the clearing and the moss covered. Whatever surfaces had been maintained by people who are now themselves buried under those surfaces. I don't know whether what I hear is an echo of something that existed 150 years ago. I don't know. I know the sound. I know it's gravel. I know there's no gravel there. and I know that whoever is walking behind me stops when I reach the road, as if the boundary between the trail and the pavement is a line that they recognize and that I can cross and they cannot. The cemetery keeps its stones, the trail keeps its surface, and twice a year, in late October, something walks behind me on a path that only it can feel. The storm arrived faster than the forecast had predicted, which is a thing that storms in the Appalachian Mountains do with a regularity that should teach forecasters humility and that, despite decades of experience, continues to catch hikers in positions they wouldn't have chosen if the weather had behaved according to the models. I was hiking alone on a section of the AT in western Maine, the Mahoosic Range, which is consistently rated as the most difficult section of the entire trail. The terrain so steep and so rocky and so relentlessly vertical that thru-hikers who have walked 1,000 miles to get there still describe the Mahoosics as the hardest thing they've done. The Mahoosic Notch, the most famous feature of the range, is a mile-long boulder field at the bottom of a narrow gap where hikers crawl and climb through and between house-sized rocks that have tumbled from the cliffs above. The passage taking most people 2 to 3 hours to cover a single mile. I was not hiking the Notch on this trip. I was on a section to the north. But the Notch's reputation gives a sense of what the range demands and what the people who hike it are prepared for. I was a carpenter from Portland, Maine, 46 years old. And I'd been hiking sections of the Maine for 8 years with the particular determination of someone who lives close enough to difficult terrain to access it regularly and who has the kind of body shaped by manual work that handles the demands of mountain hiking without the training that office workers need before they attempt it. Carpentry and hiking share a relationship with physical effort that people who do both understand. The familiarity with sustained exertion and the comfort with discomfort and the particular patience that both require. The willingness to keep working when the work is hard because stopping doesn't get the thing done. One knew the Mahoosics. I knew what they asked. I had developed over 8 years of regular trips. The particular respect for the range that comes from having been humbled by it enough times to understand that the mountains don't care about your fitness level or your experience, and that the weather and the terrain will do what they do regardless of your plans. The lean-to was not a shelter I'd planned to use. My itinerary had me reaching a different shelter 2 miles further north. But the storm changed the plan the way storms change plans, absolutely and without negotiation. The sky went from overcast to dark in 20 minutes, and the wind came up from the southwest, with the particular force that a frontal system produces when it meets a mountain range and is forced upward and the pressure differential accelerates. The wind through the gaps and over the ridges. The first rain arrived in the way that mountain rain arrives when the system behind it is serious. Not gradually but all at once. The transition from dry to soaked happening in seconds rather than minutes. I was on an exposed ridge when it hit. The nearest shelter on my map was a lean-to marked with the small rectangle symbol that the guide uses for 3-sided structures. 4 miles ahead on a side trail that dropped off the ridge to the east, I reached the lean-to in rain that had intensified from heavy to violent, the particular driving rain that the mountains produce when a system stalls against a ridge and dumps its entire moisture load in one area. The lean-to was older than most of the shelters on the main AT, which are already old. The construction showing the particular craftsmanship of a structure built by hand from local timber by people who understood both wood and weather, and who built things to last without building them to impress. The roof was sound, the cedar shakes overlapping tightly enough that no water came through despite the force of the rain. The 3 walls were solid, the logs fitted together with the kind of joinery that I recognized as skilled work, the notches clean and the gaps minimal, and the whole structure settling over decades into the particular solidity that well-built log construction achieves when gravity has had time to seat every joint. The floor was a raised wooden platform, dry despite the rain, and the open front faced downhill away from the wind direction. which meant the interior was sheltered from all but the most wind-driven spray. I ducked in and dropped my pack and stood there dripping and grateful. I set up my sleeping pad and bag on the platform, and I ate a cold dinner because cooking in a lean-to during a lightning storm struck me as unwise, and because the lightning that was now accompanying the rain was close enough that the interval between flash and thunder was less than 2 seconds. I ate peanut butter on crackers and drank water and sat with my back against the rear wall and watched the storm do everything it was capable of. The rain coming in sheets and the wind bending the spruce trees and the lightning illuminating the forest in white snapshots that showed every detail of the trees and the ground and the rain in frozen clarity before returning everything to darkness. It was during one of these lightning flashes that I first noticed the scratch marks. The flash lasted half a second, and in that half second, the walls of the lean-to were illuminated in the flat, white, shadowless light that closed lightning produces. And I saw the marks. They were everywhere on the inside surfaces of all 3 walls, from the platform level up to as high as a person could reach. The wood showing long parallel scratches that ran in groups of 3 or 4, the kind of marks that you associate immediately with claws or with a tool drawn across a surface under deliberate pressure. The marks were deep enough to have removed the surface layer of the wood and to have exposed the lighter grain beneath. They were not random. They were not the product of weathering or insect damage or the kind of surface wear that old wood develops. Through exposure, they were scratches made by something pressed hard against the wood, and they ran uniformly downward. Each set of parallel lines descending from approximately shoulder height toward the platform in strokes that were roughly 2 feet long. I turned on my headlamp and examined them with the attention that a carpenter gives to marks on wood. Particular professional scrutiny that comes from years of studying what tools and forces do to surfaces. The walls were covered, hundreds of sets of marks, overlapping in places, the older ones darkened by age and the oxidation that exposed wood undergoes over time, and the newer ones showing the pale, fresh grain of recently cut timber. I ran my finger along several of the marks. The depth was consistent, approximately 1/8 of an inch, deep enough that whatever made them had pressed with real force. The width of each individual scratch was narrow, maybe 1/16 of an inch, and the spacing between parallel scratches within each group was even roughly half an inch apart. 3 or 4 parallel lines, evenly spaced, uniform in depth and width, repeated hundreds of times across every reachable interior surface. As a carpenter who has spent 20 years reading the marks that tools make on wood, I can tell you that these were not made by any conventional tool I know. A chisel leaves a different profile. A knife leaves a different edge. A rake or a comb leaves marks that are wider and more variable in depth. And animal claws, which was the obvious thought, leave marks that vary in spacing and depth, because the anatomy of a paw produces inconsistent pressure across the toes. These marks were too uniform to be animal, too narrow to be a standard tool, too numerous and too consistently executed to be the work of a single episode, and some of them, on the rear wall directly behind where I was sitting, were very new. The wood in the scratches was pale and clean, and the tiny fibers at the edges of the cuts were still raised and hadn't been pressed flat by moisture or contact. These marks had been made recently, within days. The storm continued. I was not leaving. Outside was lightning and horizontal rain and a mountain ridge that was no place to be. I settled in with the rational understanding that the marks were old accumulations, that whatever had made them was not currently present, that I was alone in a lean-to, in a storm, and the safest thing to do was stay put. The rational part of my mind presented these facts calmly. The rest of my mind spent the night in a state of alert attention that I could not override. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, during a lull when the rain eased and the wind dropped and the forest went briefly, uncannily quiet, I heard it. A sound from the exterior of the rear wall, directly behind my head, a slow, deliberate, downward scraping, the sound of something being drawn across wood with pressure. The particular sound that a hard edge makes on a wooden surface when it is cutting rather than sliding, the sound of material being removed, of grain being split, of the surface of the wood giving way under something sharp and heavy. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then it stopped, then it started again, from a slightly different position on the same wall, same downward motion, same pressure, same duration. 3 seconds of careful, measured scratching, stop, shift position. 3 seconds more. I did not move. I sat on the platform with my back no longer against the rear wall, having pulled forward instinctively when the sound began. And I stared at the wall and I listened. The scratching came 3 more times, each time from a slightly different position, each time with the same deliberate pace, the sound of something that was doing exactly what it intended to do. And that was not hurrying, and that was not concerned about the person sitting 6 inches of log wall away from whatever was making the marks. Then it stopped. The storm resumed. The rain came back and the wind returned, and the sounds of weather filled the lean-to. And whatever had been on the other side of the wall was either gone or was continuing its work beneath the noise of the storm where I could no longer distinguish it. In the morning the storm had broken, and the forest was wet and dripping, and the light came in clean and gray. I walked around to the rear wall. The exterior showed the same marks as the interior, hundreds of downward scratches covering the logs, and on the lower right section, at the height where the sounds had come from, fresh marks, 3 sets of 4 parallel lines, the wood pale and newly exposed, made that night, made while I sat on the other side and listened. I reported the condition to the maintaining club. The volunteer I spoke with said he'd check it. I never heard back. I checked the shelter log 2 months later. No entries mentioned marks or sounds. The logbook read the way logbooks read: weather and water sources and grateful notes about dry places and storms. Either the marks were unremarkable to other hikers, or they were something that others like me noticed and chose to keep to themselves. I am a carpenter. I have spent my professional life understanding what happens when forces act on wood. Blades cut clean, claws tear uneven, weather cracks along the grain, insects bore round holes. What I heard that night and what I saw the next morning fits none of these categories, and the lean-to stands in the Mahoosics with its marks on every wall, deepening, accumulating, added to by something that comes in storms or in the dark or whenever no one is looking. And the wood holds the record of every visit, the way wood holds everything, faithfully in the grain until someone replaces the boards or the structure falls or the forest takes it back. The campsite was wrong before I could articulate why it was wrong. The recognition arriving in the body before it reached the mind. The particular tightening in the chest and the slight acceleration of the pulse that the human nervous system produces when it detects a pattern that means danger, even when the conscious brain hasn't finished cataloging what it's seeing. I've thought about that a lot since, the fact that my body knew before I did. This is something that people who spend extended time in wild places understand in a way that is difficult to convey to people who don't. The knowledge that your body is reading the environment constantly, and that it reads faster and more accurately than your deliberate thoughts, and that the moments when your body tightens and your breathing changes are the moments you should listen to rather than explain away. I was 42 years old and I was an electrician by trade, working for a company in Johnson City, Tennessee, that handled commercial and industrial jobs across the Tri-Cities area, the kind of steady, physically demanding work that shapes your hands and your posture and your relationship with problem solving in ways that carry over into every other part of your life. I'd been hiking the Atian sections for 15 years, starting in my late 20s when I needed something to structure the weekends around, something that was physical and solitary, and that took me out of the particular routines of work and home and the small city social life that Johnson City offers, and put me somewhere where the only problems were navigation and weather and the limits of my own endurance. 15 years of section hiking had given me roughly 1,200 miles of the trail, scattered across every state from Georgia to New Hampshire, completed in the non-sequential patchwork fashion that section hikers use, picking sections based on proximity and season and available time and the particular logistical calculus that a working person applies to the problem of wanting to walk a very long trail without quitting their job to do it. I knew the trail, knew what normal looked like in dozens of different sections and conditions and seasons. I knew what a campsite looked like when it was between guests, the cold fire ring and the flattened ground and the faint smell of old ash. I knew what a campsite looked like when it was occupied, the tent and the gear and the human presence that changes the character of a clearing from empty to inhabited. I knew the difference between the two states the way an electrician knows the difference between a live wire and a dead one, by experience, and by the particular attention that years of professional practice develop. The section one was hiking that September was in the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee, a 2-day out and back that followed a stretch of the Add along the ridgeline, between the Nolichucky River drainage and the valleys to the south. The trail in the Cherokee passes through hardwood forest that in September still holds the full green of late summer, the canopy dense and the shade deep, and the undergrowth showing the particular lushness that a wet summer produces, the ferns, and the nettles and the rhododendron filling the gaps between the trees in a density that limits visibility off trail to 20 or 30 feet. I was on my second day, heading back south toward my car at the trailhead, covering ground I'd hiked the day before in the opposite direction. The morning was warm and humid, the kind of September morning in the Tennessee mountains, where the air holds overnight moisture and the forest feels close and damp, and the light under the canopy is soft and diffused. I came around a bend in the trail at approximately 9:30 in the morning, and the campsite was there, an established site, the kind of cleared and flattened area near the trail that generations of hikers have worn into recognizability. A fire ring of stacked stones and flat spots for tents, and a beaten side path to the water source. I had passed this campsite the previous day heading north. It had been empty then, cold ashes and bare ground, the particular still quality of a place between occupants. Now it was occupied, or it had been. A tent was set up at the flat spot nearest the trail, a 2-person backpacking tent, orange and gray, the fly taut and properly staked, the vestibule unzipped and open. The door rolled back to show the interior, where a sleeping bag lay unzipped on a pad with a stuff sack at the head end and a headlamp clipped to the interior loop, and a paperback book face down beside the pad, open to whatever page the reader had stopped at. A large pack, 60 liters or more, the size that suggests a long trip or a hiker who hasn't learned to go light, sat propped against a tree with the hip belt unbuckled and a water bottle in the side pocket. A pair of trekking poles leaned against the same tree. A bandana hung from a branch to dry. Camp shoes, the rubber sandals that hikers change into at camp, sat side by side near the tent's entrance. The fire ring held a fire, not coals, not embers. Active flames, small but present, the wood recently fed. The particular stage of a fire that someone has been maintaining within the last 10 or 15 minutes. The smoke rose in a thin column through the still morning air and on a flat rock. Beside the fire ring sat an aluminum backpacking pot with oatmeal in it. I could see the oatmeal. I could smell it. The pot was steaming. I stood at the edge of the campsite, and I looked at this scene with the full attention of a person who has spent 15 years learning what normal looks like in the backcountry, and who was looking at something that was not normal. Everything about the campsite said occupied. Everything about the campsite said active, present, in progress. The particular quality of a space where someone is currently doing something and has been doing it moments ago. The sleeping bag was unzipped as if someone had just gotten up from it. The book was face down and open as if someone had just set it aside. The fire was burning as if someone had just added wood. The oatmeal was steaming as if someone had just cooked it, and no one was there. The tent was visible and empty. The clearing was visible and empty. The water source was visible through the trees. A small stream 30 feet downhill, and no one was at it. The trail was visible in both directions, and no one was on it. The forest around the campsite was open enough at that point, the undergrowth sparse in the shade of the mature oaks, that a person standing or sitting within 50 feet would have been visible. No one was visible. The campsite was full of a person's presence and empty of the person. I said hello. The word landed flat. I said it again, louder, projecting in a circle that covered the tent and the woods and the trail and the water source. Nothing, no response, no movement, no rustle of someone standing up or turning around or stepping out from behind a tree. The only sounds were the fire crackling and the stream running and the particular morning birdsong that the Cherokee produces in September. The wood thrush and the Carolina wren and the towhees calling from the undergrowth, as if nothing unusual was happening. As if the campsite was exactly what it appeared to be. A normal campsite in a normal forest on a normal morning. The oatmeal was steaming. I keep returning to this fact because the physics of it constrain the timeline. Hot oatmeal in a small aluminum pot on an open rock in 70-degree air with a light breeze stopped steaming within 10 to 15 minutes. Whoever cooked this oatmeal had done so very recently, wherever they had gone. They had gone within the last quarter hour, and wherever they had gone without eating their breakfast, and without their pack, and without their poles, and without their camp shoes, and without closing their tent, which meant they had gone without the deliberate preparation that any departure from a campsite involves, the packing and the organizing and the decision-making that turns a campsite from occupied to vacated. I waited 20 minutes. I sat on a log near the trail, not touching anything in the campsite, and I waited for whoever belonged to this scene to return from whatever errand or call of nature or momentary absence had taken them away from their cooking breakfast. No one came. The fire burned lower. The oatmeal stopped steaming. The campsite sat there with all of its evidence of a person and none of the person. The particular wrongness of a scene that has everything except the one element that would make it complete. I hiked out. I called the Forest Service Ranger Station from my car at the trailhead, because an unattended fire in a national forest is a reportable concern, regardless of the circumstances around it. The ranger took my information and the location and said someone would check. I gave the GPS coordinates from my phone. I never heard back. I don't know what they found or whether they found anything, or whether the campsite was packed up and cold by the time anyone got there. I have thought about explanations. A day hiker who left their overnight camp to do a side trail without their pack. A person who wandered off to use the bathroom at exactly the moment I arrived and who returned after I left. A section hiker who decided to explore the stream and walked further than they intended. Each explanation accounts for some of the facts. None of them account for the steaming oatmeal and the burning fire and the unzipped sleeping bag and the open book and the complete absence of any response to a stranger standing at the edge of your campsite, calling hello twice. People who step away from their camp for 10 minutes, leave footprints on the path to wherever they've gone. People who are within earshot of their camp hear someone calling. People who have just cooked breakfast, eat the breakfast before they leave. The Cherokee National Forest is where it has always been, and the trail still runs through it. And the campsite still sits by the trail with its fire ring, and its flat spots and its path to the water. I have hiked past it twice since that September morning. Both times it was empty, the fire ring cold, the clearing showing nothing but the packed ground and the faint charcoal smell that a campsite holds between visitors. Both times I stopped and I looked at it, and I thought about the steaming oatmeal and the open book and the unzipped tent and the person who belonged to all of it and who was not there. The oatmeal was steaming, the person was gone, and those two facts exist side by side in my memory the way the campsite existed that morning, complete and wrong and unanswered. I need to be careful about how I tell this because the telling itself is the problem. The thing that makes people look at you a certain way and assign you to a category of person that you don't want to be assigned to. The category that includes People who see things that aren't there, who tell stories that can't be verified, who are, in the assessment of reasonable people, either lying or mistaken, or experiencing something that has a clinical explanation rooted in exhaustion or dehydration, or the particular unreliability of the human brain when it is operating under conditions it was not designed for. I am not lying. I may be mistaken. I have considered the exhaustion and the dehydration and the unreliability. I have considered them for 4 years, and I have not arrived at an explanation that satisfies me, which is itself a kind of answer, the kind that doesn't close anything, but that at least acknowledges the shape of the thing that remains open. I was 38 years old. I was a high school history teacher in Waynesboro, Virginia, which sits at the base of the Blue Ridge at Rockfish Gap, where the IT crosses Interstate 64 and where Shenandoah National Park begins its long run north through the mountains to Front Royal. I'd been hiking the AT since I was a teenager, starting with my father, who had done his own through hike in 1982, and who had raised me with the trail as a fixed element of the family landscape, the way some families have a lake house or a cabin, or a particular beach that they return to every year, and that becomes part of the family's identity, the place where the family exists in its truest and most complete form. The AT was my family's place. It was where my father and I had our best conversations and our longest silences, and the particular closeness that fathers and sons achieve when they are doing something together that requires effort, and that leaves no room for the awkwardness that domestic settings sometimes produce. I knew the Virginia sections with the intimate familiarity that 20 years of walking them in every season and every condition produces, the trails mapped in my body as much as in any guidebook. My father had died 2 years before the hike I'm going to describe. Heart attack. Sudden and complete, and without the warning that the medical system is supposed to provide when someone has a condition that is detectable and treatable, and that, had it been detected and treated, might have allowed him to continue walking the trail that had been the central structure of his relationship with his son and with the mountains, and with the particular version of himself that he was when he was in the woods. I hiked more after he died. This is the thing that people do with grief when the grief is attached to an activity, an attachment so deep that the activity and the person become fused, and the only way to be near the person who is gone is to do the thing they did in the places they did it, carrying the equipment they carried and reading the guidebook they annotated and walking the trails that their boots were smoother over 30 years of repetition. I was carrying his old guidebook, a dog-eared annotated copy from several editions prior, the pages soft from use and the binding held together with duct tape, and the margins filled with his handwriting, the small precise notation that he used for trail notes, water sources and campsites and viewpoints, and the particular observations that he made about sections he'd hiked multiple times, the changes he noticed from year to year in the trail's condition and the forest's character and the shelter's state of repair. I carried the guidebook partly for the practical information and partly for the handwriting, which was as close to his voice as anything I still had access to. The section one was hiking was a 3-day stretch in the George Washington National Forest, running south from Rockfish Gap through the mountainous terrain between the Blue Ridge and the Shenandoah Valley. The section is not heavily trafficked. The shelters are spaced at reasonable intervals, and the trail is well maintained, but the relative obscurity of the section, compared to the Shenandoah stretch to the north, means that solitude is the norm, particularly on weekdays in the shoulder season. I was hiking in early October, a Tuesday through Thursday, 3 days and 2 nights, alone with my father's guidebook and the particular quality of grief that shows up not as sadness but as attention, the heightened awareness of details that a bereaved person brings to the places where the dead person lived most fully. On the second day, I was covering the stretch between 2 shelters that I knew by name and by the particular characteristics that made each one identifiable. The first in a hollow near a reliable spring, the second on a ridge with views to the west, my plan had me reaching the ridge shelter by late afternoon. 14 miles of steady walking through forest that was beginning to turn. The earliest maples showing red along the ridgeline while the oaks and hickories held green. The sky was clear. The air was cool in the way that early October air is cool at elevation. The temperature requiring a light layer in the morning, and nothing but a t-shirt by noon. I was making good time at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I came to a side trail marked with a blue blaze on a tree at a junction with the 8. The blue blaze was clear and fresh. The paint the standard blue that trail clubs use for side trails, and that is as recognizable to 8A hikers as the white blaze. That marks the main trail. The side trail angled to the right and descended slightly, disappearing into the forest through a corridor of mature hardwoods. I looked at my guidebook. No side trail was listed at this location, my father's marginal. Notes for this section mentioned 2 water sources and a viewpoint. He did not mention a side trail or a shelter. I followed the side trail. This was not a decision I deliberated about. I followed it the way you follow blue blazes, automatically, with the trained trust that years of hiking develop, the understanding that blue blazes lead to something worth leading to, water sources or viewpoints or shelters or the particular features that trail clubs mark because they serve hikers and because the marking system works. The side trail was approximately 50 yards long and it ended at a clearing where a shelter sat. The shelter was a standard 8 shelter, 3 walls, a roof, a raised wooden platform, a fire ring in the clearing. It was in good condition. The wood was weathered but sound, the logs showing the silver-gray color that aged timber develops in. That says decades rather than years. The roof was intact, the shakes overlapping cleanly. The platform was clean, the boards worn smooth by the sleeping bags of many hikers. A logbook sat in a plastic bag on a nail driven into the left wall. The standard setup. The clearing was flat and well drained, and the trees around it were old enough that their canopy formed a complete cover overhead. The light coming through in the dappled shifting pattern that a hardwood canopy produces on a clear afternoon in early October. The leaves still thick enough to filter the sun, but thin enough that the light had a golden, autumnal quality that it wouldn't have had in midsummer. I sat on the platform edge, I drank water, I ate trail mix. I looked at the clearing, and I considered staying here rather than continuing 5 or 6 miles to the ridge shelter. The ridge shelter would have views but would have the wind that ridge shelters always have. This shelter was protected and quiet, and comfortable in the way that a good shelter is comfortable. The particular feeling of rightness that some shelters have, and that others don't. The quality that has nothing to do with construction and everything to do with placement and proportion, and the way the structure sits in its clearing, and the clearing sits in the forest, and the forest sits on the mountain. The shelter felt right. It felt, in a way I recognized but couldn't have articulated at the time, like a place my father would have chosen. I opened the logbook. The entries were sparse but present, names and dates, and brief notes. The most recent entry was from a week prior. I wrote my own entry, my name and the date, and a note about conditions. I decided to stay. I set up my sleeping bag. I cooked dinner as the light changed. I watched the clearing darken. I slept well. Better than I'd slept on the trail since my father died. The particular deep and dreamless sleep that I associated with safety, with shelter, with the feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be. In the morning, I packed up and hiked out the side trail to the At and turned north. That evening, at the ridge shelter, I examined my father's guidebook closely. I checked the section maps. I checked the narrative descriptions. I checked his marginal notes. No shelter was listed between the hollow shelter and the ridge shelter. No side trail was shown. No blue blazed junction appeared on any map or in any description. The Potomac Appalachian Trail Club, which maintains that section of the AT, lists every shelter in their jurisdiction with GPS coordinates and construction dates and capacity information. I checked their website when I got home. There was no shelter at the location where I had slept. I hiked back the next day, my third day, my last. Heading south to my car, I walked the section slowly, watching every tree for the blue blaze that had marked the junction. I examined every apparent side trail. I walked the entire stretch of AT between the ridge shelter and the hollow shelter, paying the kind of focused, deliberate attention that you pay when you are looking for something specific and that something is not where it should be.